Hello and welcome back to my channel, She Sews Happiness. I'm Mary Ellen and yeah, I'm going to share with you what I'm getting up to on my day off today. So I think it's coffee number 3. I have the first pre-wash on. So yeah, my days off are usually spent either catching up with my laundry or pre-washing, not necessarily in that order. So I've got some pre-wash going on at the moment. The laundry will come later. And the first thing I'm going to work on today is a toile. So I have a new pattern which I am going to be using to create a blog post for Jenny Stitches Fabrics. And as I've never made the pattern before, obviously the first thing I'm going to have to do is toile. So here's my pattern. I usually buy PDF patterns because I can print off a couple of copies and not have to trace. One I can manipulate and destroy by making my toiles and adjustments, and then the other I'll make those adjustments onto for the finalized version and then just have the wonderful, perfect finished pattern pieces. But this is a paper version of the pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is go and trace off just the bodice pieces. So when I'm doing my toiles, unless it's a fitted skirt, which this one does not have, I do only toile the bodice pieces and the sleeves. So if the sleeves are a fitted sleeve, I'll always toile those as well, because I'm sure you've heard me say 100 times, I always have issues fitting sleeves and always have to do a decent full bicep adjustment. So that's the first thing I'm going to do this morning. And after that, I'm going to cut out the pieces for my project that I hopefully will get to this afternoon then. That is the Sew Over It penny dress. So this is actually the only Sew Over It pattern that I don't have in PDF form, because I do prefer PDF to paper patterns. This one actually came in the Simply Sewing magazine, I think it was like last year, and yeah, I thought I'd give it a go. It's from the vintage line of patterns, so definitely go-tos for me. And I think I've now made possibly 3 of those, and if I can find images of those, I'll slot them in to show you. This is one of my work staples. I do wear the versions that I've got really frequently, and yeah, I want to make another because obviously I do use them quite a bit and they're pretty versatile and transitional throughout the seasons. So that's on my agenda too. So I'm going to go and toile and see how I get on, and I'm going to cut out my fabric for the penny dress, and then I'll come back and see you just a little bit later on, after my coffee as well, of course. Okay, I'm back. I've already had lunch, so you can tell everything went a bit slowly earlier on. I've made a toile of the dress for my blog post for Jenny Stitches, and I'm pretty happy with it. I think the only adjustments I'm actually going to have to make, so I'll have it here, the only adjustments I'm going to have to make are to move the darts ever so slightly. That's always the one basic adjustment I make to pretty much 9 out of 10 patterns, because the bust apex very seldom matches up to my own. So I always end up moving the darts ever so slightly to match up to my own bust apex. And then the back darts are actually fine. I don't need to let any room out. I don't need to take anything in. Apart from moving those, I think I'm actually okay. I haven't actually stitched one of the sleeves in yet because the sleeves aren't actually all that fitted. So I think the option I'm going for is the looser option, because summer, spring, they're, you know, I know spring doesn't really seem to be here yet, but they are just around the corner, and I want to get the most out of my dress, which will eventually be made in that beautiful, in fact, it's just about to go into pre-wash now. So this beautiful fabric Godmother viscose twill. But yeah, I've just twirled it up actually in a poly cotton. So I know when we're twirling, usually calico is the way to go, but for me, calico can sometimes be just a little bit too rigid and doesn't give me a fair assessment of how the fit will be in drapier, looser fabrics. So I think because I'm making it in this viscose twill, which does have a wee bit of body to it, but also quite a bit of drape. In terms of weight, they're actually very similar. So I've used this poly cotton, and I remember Stitch and Ink were selling this off, and it was like ridiculously cheap, but it was cheaper than calico, and I thought, well, that's going to be perfect for doing my toiles, because as you all know, my toiles are essential. They're not optional. And that's not to say I enjoy them, because actually I bloody hate them. I think they're really, really tedious and quite dull. And I think when you're sewing and you only have a day to do something, you just want to get into the project. That's when your next day off has to come into play, because the toiling is not worth skipping. So yeah, for me, I always start with this measurement here, and then usually I have to do full bust adjustments as well as other little modifications. The pattern, which is still a secret unless you caught a snippet of it there earlier on, does have cup sizes built in. So the only spoiler I'll give you is it's a cashmerette pattern, and being a cashmerette pattern, then it does come in 3 bust sizes. So you have your CD cup, your EF cup, and your GH cup, and I'm making the GH, and it is perfect. I've probably talked about this recently with you. I have only come, even though I'm a curvy sewist, I have only come to the cashmerette pattern range pretty recently, as they never really seemed up my street until I started using my imagination a little bit more. And actually when I start to combine my fabric choices and making little tweaks, I can make those patterns work for my vintage inspired wardrobe. Imagination goes a long way. So I'm toiling away, I'm happy with that. I'll make the adjustments, and then I have to trace off all of the other pieces, unless I just be reckless and cut into the paper pattern. And I try not to, but we never know, do we, what mood we're going to be in. So I think I'll leave that now on the back burner until the weekend, when I do have a little bit more time. And then also what I've got done this morning is I have cut out my penny dress. So these are all the pieces, minus one that I just dropped, for the penny. And yeah, I'm going to sew that up then this afternoon. I mean, it's already 2 o'clock, so I don't have all the time in the world. But I will see how far I get between dog demands and pre-washing and actual laundry, and maybe even a little bit of ironing, and then get the dinner and stuff sorted. So I probably have a couple of hours all in all, and if I'm not distracted, I probably could get the whole thing sewn up, but because I'll be chatting as well, maybe I won't. So I am going to kind of like sew along with you. I'm not going to give you the minutiae, and you're not going to get a second by second rundown or anything like that, but I just thought I would show you how the penny dress comes together. It's a beautiful, beautiful pattern, and it's another one of those sew over it dresses that I haven't had to make any adjustments to, much like the Marguerite. So again, it's all in the drafting of the pattern. So the pattern itself is pretty simple. So you have this lovely grown on sleeve, so no sleeve adjustments necessary. You have this button down front placket. Now, because there's actually quite a lot of ease in this, you could potentially get away without actually putting the buttonholes in and just stitching your buttons on. I do tend to make my buttonholes anyhow because I quite enjoy it. I know, I'm strange. And then it's got this elasticated waistband. So again, no fitting to do at the waist, and then a full circle skirt. And I think that's one of the things about this dress that would make me quite impatient, and that's the fact that I do have to wait a couple of days for the skirt to drop, particularly in a very flimsy viscose fabric like the one I'm using, which is from Rainbow Fabrics Kilburn. And I can't resist that colour. It's just a staple in my wardrobe, as I think I've told you before in my fabric haul videos. So hopefully this turns out to be as pretty as it looks in my head. But yeah, in terms of fitting, you'll get on really, really well with this. So you'll see basically then that everything is kind of fitted at the waist, apart from the shoulder detailing. So there is a bit of gathering there at the shoulders, and that does help bring a little bit of shape around the bust. But yeah, it almost seems too good to be true. A shirt dress without as much as a dart. But yeah, I love it. Now the sizes in this are 8 to 20. Whether or not they go up to, let me see, I'm not sure if they actually do go up any more than that if you buy the PDF version from Sew Over It directly. but I'll check it for you right now. They have been in the process of expanding their dress sizes, which has been amazing. And I think Marguerite has now been extended as well, which is fantastic because I recommend it to everybody. Let me see. Yeah, so the PDF now comes in different versions. So you can buy it as size 6 to 30. You can also buy it as 18 to 30 or 6 to 20. And because this one came in the magazine, it's actually 8 to 20. So US 6 to 18, European 36 to 48. And the measurements, because of the fit of it, are pretty generous. So size 20, for instance, would fit a bust 45, waist 38, hips 48, whereas the 8 would be bust 33, waist 26, and hips 36. Without further ado then, let's get stuck in. So the first thing I have to do, and again what you'll find is with the magazine patterns, you have slightly more limited instructions. So these are the instructions here. They wouldn't be as full, I don't think, as the PDF versions, which are generally pages and pages long with more in-depth, I know, another coffee, more in-depth images and things like that too. But I've made it before, I haven't had any issues, so let's see how we get on. The other thing is I've put in a really sharp needle because this is such a fine fabric that I really don't want it to snag. In fact, some people might actually prefer to have this lined, but I will wear a slip underneath this dress, so it really doesn't matter to me at all. So the first thing then I'm going to do, if I just refer to my instructions, is make the bodice. So on the front and back bodice pieces, I have to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches between the circles on the shoulders within the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Easy enough. Let's get set up. So obviously the first thing I want to do is increase the length of my stitches since they are for gathering. There's my snips. That part is easy enough. I can set those aside. And then we have shoulder panels. So shoulder panels are here. There's not much to them actually, just a couple of really small little pieces. But it says then to pull the threads slightly, etc. Pin the front bodice piece and the front edge of the shoulder panel at the shoulder seams, adjusting the gathers to fit and stitch in place. So the other thing to bear in mind whenever you're looking at these pieces is that there is a front shoulder and a back shoulder piece. The front shoulder piece is the one that is straight. The back has this little extra bit of fabric on it. So let me just get that on. And of course, before you sew these pieces in place, have to bring the stitch length back to normal after lengthening it. As I said, I'm using a really fine fabric, so I am trying to remember to keep my pins within the seam allowances, just in case there should be any snags or anything like that. So once I've done that, then I'm going to overlock those seams and press them towards the shoulder panel. And obviously the next thing I'm going to do is repeat that for the back shoulder seams. Okay, so that is the front and the back bodice attached. Okay, so you can kind of see with all the gathers, it's kind of coming to shape already. And then the next thing you'll do is you'll overlock the outside edges and then press those in by 5/8 of an inch. And now we're going to kind of create our armholes and join our side seams together. While I have just pressed it, I'm just going to kind of like unfold it temporarily. And then I'm going to pin my side seams together up until the notch. There's a wee notch there just for the underarm. And then I'm going to stitch both of those together. That's simple. Lost my pedal. And of course, because the arm is just grown on, and then we're going to kind of like top stitch the armhole in place. We need to make sure to back stitch properly. At the notch of the underarm. And I do tend to do this a couple of times just to reinforce it, so that you can ensure you get to wear it quite a lot. For me, that's one of the things I always tend to really do whenever I'm creating my handmade garments. I'm thinking like, what other little things can I do here just to make this garment last as long as it possibly can. Because for me, one of the biggest instigations of sewing my own handmade wardrobe is that I have a sustainable wardrobe. And by sustainable, I mean a wardrobe filled with clothes that I will want to wear again and again and again, and that I will invest in and spend time repairing if it ever comes to that. But I try to make sure it doesn't come to that. You'll probably see a couple of other little things that I do later on to ensure that as well. So now on the other side, back stitching again, and back stitching once more. Doesn't do any harm. It's only a piece of thread, isn't it? So that's that done. Then I'm going to press those seam allowances open here, and then we'll get on to the arms. Much like toiling, I have to admit, pressing for me is not a step I would ever skip. I do remember actually about a year ago, I was in the middle of a project and my iron died. And before I could finish that project, the first thing I did was go to the store and buy a new iron, because I wasn't, even at that stage, my early days of sewing, I was not willing to skip the ironing and pressing stages of my mix. So that's those done. Then the next thing is you're going to fold the seam allowances back in at the arms. So you'd already kind of like pre-press those. And then all you're going to do with a 1 centimeter seam allowance is top stitch the whole way around the armhole. And that is the arms done. Now to do this, I'm just going to take this off my sewing machine. So I have my free arm there, and it just makes it a little easier. Now there is a tricky part here. So you want to make sure you enforce it here just under the arm, because that's going to take a bit of wear and tear. So to do that, what I'll be doing is literally stitching across the armholes at that point. Just across those 2 seam allowances to keep everything neatly in place. Of course, making sure to back stitch. As obvious as it sounds. And I'll probably do it a couple of times just for reinforcements. Just want to make sure my seams are nice. I know you can't see this, but it's actually one of the things I'm hoping to work on is a secondary camera, but I'm not doing anything really complicated. If I do anything really complicated, I'll actually move everything around and show you. So a couple of back stitches in there. And I'm just going to sew around, pivoting. So around my entire armhole. It's really simple make, most of it. There might be a couple of tricky bits, but I'll show you those later. There we go. here, my underarm, you can see properly reinforced, and then just sewn the whole way around the arm. And that is the arm done. Does need a wee bit of a press there, so I'll do the other one, then I'll press them, and then we'll move on to the next stage. So then my next step is to construct the facing pieces, which is simple enough to do. You have your back facing and you have your front facing pieces, which are interfaced. You literally join them together there at the shoulder seams, finish your facing on the outside the whole way around. And of course, if you are a label person, it's the perfect opportunity to stitch in a little label as well. Saves you any faffing about whenever you're done later on. And then this is actually where the penny dress deviates a little bit from anything that I've been used to doing. So when you're making shirt dresses or shirts, anything with a colour really, I mean, usually as far as I know, what you do is you actually get your colour pieces in first. And I suppose I should try it someday just to see if it works. But for this pattern, you don't put your collar piece in first. You start with your facing. But you only sew in the facing at the front of the dress. So yeah, it's a bit strange. I haven't come across that before. So literally just down the front, there are a couple of notches, which just helps to bring everything together. I have to say this was a bit of a murderous fabric just to cut out. It's so flimsy and thin that it did move quite a bit. So I think my biggest fear was that the pieces would warp, particularly the smaller, thinner pieces. But there we are. I've just pinned down the first front side and I've been okay. Let's see if the other side works just as well. So bring this on round. It's definitely one of those fabrics that I'll have to wear with a slip. Where I work, there are these escalators, and whenever I work anywhere near them, my clothes seem to pick up some kind of static, and I think this one will be particularly guilty of that. So definitely a dress for wearing a slip underneath, which is good because I haven't lined it. Might get away with it actually, because whenever I put it on the skin, it doesn't look too bad. Maybe just wear a little skirt slip or something like that. But we'll see. Nothing wrong with taking a wee risk or two, is there? So I'm going to stitch down the front, attaching my interfaced pieces, and yeah, then we'll come back and do the next step. Okay, so with that done then, the next step, according to the instructions, is to press those seam allowances towards your facing pieces. Absolute waste of time. I don't understand why pattern instructions tell you to press things when their next instruction then is to neatly understitch the facing to the seam allowance a couple of millimeters away from the seam. So, you know, whenever you're doing your understitching and you're stitching your seam allowance down to the facing, essentially what you're doing by doing that is pre-pressing. So I never press first. I always do my understitching, and then I use my understitching to help me press and guide my seams properly. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to understitch. So that means my seam allowances are going to be stitched to the facing, just doing top stitching on top of it there. As I say, a couple of millimeters or 1/8 of an inch away from that seam. And because it's on a straight seam, there's no need to do any notching or clipping or anything like that. We save that for curved seams. It's a bit like sewing with black, this one. The dark colours, I always find darker colours harder. to see when on the sewing machine. Similar to when I'm knitting with dark wools, I find them a little more difficult to see. So that's one side understitched. Let's go then to the other side. Again, it's one of those steps that it is not worth skipping out because, and I know a lot of people do because I've had this conversation with people before. There's one of my videos that I created way back in January when I first started my YouTube, and it was like my top 5 tips to have professional looking finished garments, and understitching was one of those. And I had several people who were just like, oh, I just can never bother doing that, I just press it in. But it's not worth just pressing it in, it's worth taking the extra few seconds. I mean, there's that understitching done in a couple of minutes. It's worth taking that time just to make sure it's done properly. And then I'll go and, where are my little snips? Keep losing them. I'll actually press that front down in place. And then the next step is attaching the collar, which does make sense in a moment, but whenever you first make this, and the first time I made it, I thought, are these instructions completely wrong? But they were not. So back in a moment. And then we're going to turn our attention to the collar. So as per usual, 2 collar pieces. And I have to say, with a fabric that is this flimsy, top tip, interface your fabric before you cut out your collar, and that way you'll have less warping and less to worry about. So you can see I've actually constructed mine already, and I'm just going to push the wee corners out because I've trimmed those down. And actually what I've done, because I've learned from experience that when I'm sewing with very, very fine viscose fabrics, that you can sometimes get wear and tear in the corners of your collar. So in the inside, I've actually used fray stopper. Just put a little dab of it in those corners, which should help, again, help my garment last a bit longer. So hopefully that works. And then what I have done, and again, it does not say to do this in the pattern, but I have actually understitched the under collar as well, because I want my collar to look as sharp as possible. Now with the shape of it, I can only kind of understitch it from here, you know, to here with the sharp collars, but every little helps, I think, and so that's what I've done. So then once I've got that constructed, the next thing I'm going to do is just match the little notches on this side of the collar. So you have 4 notches. And then I'm just going to stitch those in place within the seam allowance. It just kind of ensures that we don't have any issues a wee bit later on. All right, so in my seam allowance, the old pedal again. Sometimes when the dogs are running underneath me, the pedal can kind of just go astray. All right, let's see. Wee machine tack. I'll save us a wee bit of faffing about whenever we go to attach the collar to the neckline, the bodice. And in spite of this being slippery and colorful, I did manage to be quite precise in cutting out the collar so it fits just so, thankfully. I was kind of concerned it would be a bit warped and the 2 pieces wouldn't line up. After all, one was interfaced, one was not. Trim off my wee threads, and then basically I'm going to match up, once I trim off that wee excess bit there of interfacing, I'm just going to match up my collar then with the neckline of my bodice. So I have 4 notches, as I said earlier, and those notches then correspond to the shoulder seam. So remember, you've got your little piece there with the back and the front shoulders linked together, making sure that my under collar is right side facing to the bodice. And actually I think that's one of those things that comes in really handy when you've actually understitched, because once you've done that stitching closed of the open ends of the collar, you kind of lose track of the under and the upper collar. So for me, because I've understitched, it's pretty clear which of the two is the under collar. And so I know to put that right side facing. So once that's pinned, I'm just going to stitch it in place with a tiny little seam allowance. It's just kind of to hold it. So like 8 millimeters, which is 5/16 of an inch for those of you who prefer inches. And it's worth doing this slowly because the last thing you want are little puckers. You know, I'm really fussy. Maybe I'm just too fussy. But I love the idea that my clothes don't look handmade. And so when people compliment me on them, I tell them I've made them, they actually look shocked. They don't believe me. 9 times out of 10, they don't believe me. And then when they realize I'm serious, they're actually astounded. And of course, that's when they ask you to make something for them, isn't it? People are so lazy. They just don't want to learn skills. They don't want to take the time. They tell me they don't have the time. But to be honest, I would have said that too. But I think you make time for the things that you enjoy and the things that you care about. And for me, a sustainable wardrobe and just the enjoyment and the pleasure I get from sewing is worth sacrificing other things. So there we go. That's it stitched in place. And then what I'm going to do is get the facing that I haven't yet stitched down in place and match that up as well. So one of the things to tell you then is whenever you're making, whenever you're sewing the facing on, you're actually just running your facing through, but what you'll find on the other side is that you've kind of got this overlap here. So you're creating your placket at the same time as sewing in the facing. So it's actually really effortless and quite easy to do. So I'm just going to stitch that in place now. And again, I do take this slowly because of the layers I'm going through. I don't want any puckers or anything like that. I don't want to have to unstitch, that's for sure. I hate unstitching pieces of fabric that have interfacing on them. I just find it a wee bit laborious and frustrating. But with all these layers, and because I'm sewing with quite a lightweight fabric, it would be easy to see little puckers. So I do pull quite tightly on my fabric, and if I have to stop and just make sure everything's positioned properly, then that's what I do. So that's my facing in. What do I do next? Understitch. So the next thing I'm going to do then is I am going to clip into the seam allowances on this occasion. So I'm going to do that, and then I am going to understitch. And this again is not worth skipping. You need a good pair of scissors for this. And just make sure you do not stitch through your line of stitching. Okay, so I've had a couple of hours away from the sewing room, kind of enforced slow because I was quite happy stitching away and sharing my project with you. But then my camera battery ran out, so I had to stop recording and let it charge. So essentially I did get on with a wee bit of the project, not much though, because I wanted you to see the rest of it. But I literally just edge stitched my little plackets in place, both sides. And then what I've done is I've just put a little securing stitch there on the bottom so that the bodice is now essentially completed. And when I go to stitch the skirt on, I have one half of my front bodice stitched to the other, so it should be quite easy. And then I've just constructed the skirt. And when I say constructed the skirt, I don't mean I've done anything amazing or wonderful or groundbreaking. The skirt is essentially one piece and it only has one seam. So you literally cut the entire skirt at once and then you sew up that one side seam. That's all there is. And you can see there's quite a lot of skirt here. It's a full circle skirt. And now I'm just going to attach my bodice to the skirt. So essentially all I'm going to do is right sides together, pop my bodice inside my skirt. Let me just get the right way up. And because it's so big and my table space is mostly being used right now, it's actually quite hard to see what I'm doing. So let me just pop that inside. The skirt itself is huge and that's all right because basically we're going to create an elastic channel to bring it all back in. So just going to stitch the whole way around it and then we will stitch it in place. We're almost finished. There's very, very little left in terms of the construction of this. So all I'm going to do literally is sew this in place, then create out of the seam allowance itself an elastic channel, put in the elastic, close it up, and that is essentially the dress complete. So yeah, I'm just going to sew that in place. If I just move my laptop out of the way and then check my trusty instructions. Where was I? I've been away for too long. So stitch around the waist with a 2 centimeter allowance, so 3/4 of an inch. I don't know about you, but my sewing table is certainly never big enough. Okay, so then the next thing, sorry from memory, I think I'm going to overlock that seam allowance. Is that correct? Overlock or zigzag? Yeah, zigzag the seam allowances together to finish them and then press it towards the bodice. Of course, this is the point at which I want to be super careful. I don't want to catch anything and create a tear in it now. Be the worst luck ever, wouldn't it? It hasn't happened to me yet, but you see it happening all the time. My heart just sinks when somebody shares that they've torn their almost finished garment on the overlocker. So hopefully just talking about it isn't actually going to curse me. So I've got that pressed. The next thing I'm going to do is just carefully pin in place the seam allowance. So pressing upwards towards the bodice. Press it in place the whole way around, because the last thing you want is to kind of freehand this and create a total mess where you've cut everything and you've ended up shortening your bodice and God knows what other travesties. So pinning the entire way around again. I'm making sure my plackets have lined up. I'm really fussy about those. Quite a lot of layers to go through. A wee bit of resistance there from the pin. So as I was saying earlier on, basically at the beginning of this video, the way in which this dress is constructed does allow a lot of ease, and that's probably why I've made a size smaller what my instincts would have told me to. I was kind of in between measurements for my high bust, and I always start with my high bust, but I actually downsized for this, and it works out quite all right. I don't have any gaping or anything at the bust, which is also a plus. It's always one of my pet peeves with ready to wear clothing. I could never get button up clothes because they never really were catered for larger busted ladies. So I've now pinned the entire way around the skirt, and I am going to sew my seam allowance onto my bodice, leaving, of course, approximately 2 inches or so of a gap to allow me to insert my elastic. I mean, I'm trying to be as careful as possible here, you know, not to have puckers or anything, but do bear in mind I'm a bit of a self-imposed perfectionist, and actually because you will be putting elastic through this casing, any wee puckers or anything are not really going to be visible in any case. But that's just me. I'm just going over that placket. So as I say, quite a few layers have built up, a wee bit of tension there. Okay, so that's that bit done. Now I just have to hope and pray I have the right size of elastic. Well, as chance would have it, I had just about enough elastic for this project. Tiny bit left over that will be of no use to me whatsoever, but sure, there we are. Just have to remind myself to get some more. So I have here my elastic on a pin, and I get rid of those because they get in the way when I'm doing this. I just find my little gap. I am going to fade my elastic through the channel, trying to keep it nice and straight, of course, as I go, because it is liable to twist sometimes. So once my elastic's in, then all that remains to do is actually stitch it in place. So I kept about 1 inch either side overlap, and I'm just going to stick on my lightning stitch because it's pretty difficult to destroy. And I'm going to stitch my elastic in. So that should be nice and secure. And now that it's stitched in, I can pull a bit more tightly just to get it in place. But I'm just going to stitch mine in place and close up that casing, and then for all intents and purposes the construction itself has been complete. So that is as far as I'm going today. That's enough sewing, I think, for one day. I can't spend the entire day doing that because there's so many other things to do, but there's not very much remaining to be done, so it's on there now so that it can drop over the next couple of evenings. There are buttonholes and buttons obviously to go on there. I need to go through my button stash and find something suitable. And then I think there's just a couple of wee bits that I would usually just stitch in place, a wee hand stitch, just to make sure nothing pops out and that the facings stay nice and secure. But yeah, there's my penny dress. And on my next episode of Sunday Sews, I will have it finished and I'll share with you then the finished look. So thank you for spending the day with me in my sewing room. I think probably all in all I've been in here for two and a half hours, and I've done all right. I've got a toile sorted. I've got my starting point then for running off the next one, and I have a dress pretty much constructed. So now I'm just going to go and tidy up. There's lots of little clippings and threads everywhere, so a wee vacuum's not going to go amiss. And I'll be back, as I say, on Sunday for my Sunday Sews, and I will see you on there. So if you've got to this point of the video, thank you for stopping by. And if you are a subscriber, thank you for subscribing to my channel. It's so nice to have you here. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe. And if you click on that little alarm bell icon there, you will be notified the next time I post a video, which will be before the end of the week. So have a fantastic week, everyone, and I will see you at the weekend. Happy stitching. Bye.